This is Herb Kelleher. He was the founder and longtime CEO of Southwest Airlines. And he's somewhat famous for saying, we have a strategic plan. Again, this was like in an investor call. Like, we have a strategic plan. It's called doing things. And here, right, he's talking a lot about, like, especially in that era, like, you'd have binders and binders of, like, here's our strategic plan. Now, the thing is that I think people misunderstand with that quote is that strategy is not necessarily equal to planning. Oftentimes you'll plan to implement the strategy, but the actual strategy isn't the plan. And this is a common trap that people will fall into. So today we'll be talking about strategic thinking and software architecture using Wardley mapping. My name is Mike Clement. I am a distinguished software engineer at Hunter Industries. We do residential and commercial irrigation and lighting. And I actually work on our golf irrigation product. Just to kind of get a sense for who's here, kind of have three main kind of items here in the title, right? Strategy, software architecture, and Wardley mapping. So by raise of hands, how many of you are here mainly because you saw strategy or strategic thinking in the title? Okay, how many are you here because you saw software architecture in the title? And how many of you are here because you saw Wardley mapping in the title? And how many of you are in the wrong place? Okay. Okay, so largely software architecture, a little bit of strategy, a little bit of Wardley mapping. So we're going to start out by talking about Southwest, but in relationship to Delta. So if you look at the fleet composition of Delta Airlines, this is according to Wikipedia as of a few months ago. These are all of the different types of aircraft that Delta has in their fleet. So you have everywhere from different types of Airbus to different types of Boeing across multiple different generations. And this is, again, a choice that they have made. Now, on the other side, if we think about, look at Southwest. Southwest early in its history had a leased fleet of 10 727s. But they early on made a decision to invest in 737s. And so even though you might see different liveries, different paint jobs from early on and then through the years, after that initial group of 727s was retired, all Southwest aircraft have been 737s. Maybe different generations, but this is the list of different aircraft in the fleet of Southwest Airlines. So you have a much shorter list here, right? But obviously more volume on each item. Now, why would they do this, right? Each of these companies has made a choice on how they're going to compose their fleet. So looking at Southwest Airlines, when it was founded, had the goal of making air travel cost the same amount as a Greyhound bus. So, right, air travel at the time when Southwest Airlines was created was like a luxury item. It was a thing that business people did, and it was expensive. You did it occasionally in your life, but it wasn't a thing that was at the point where people were doing it all the time. Many of you probably flew on an airplane just to come to this conference, which again would have been unusual 50, 60 years ago. And so that was their goal. And what they wanted to do, what they decided to do in order to achieve that goal was to have emphasize simplicity. This is one of the 12 principles of the Agile Manifesto, which may or may not be familiar to you, but this idea of simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done being essential, is part of what they deployed as their strategy. And so one aspect of that is this idea of minimizing the number of aircraft in their fleet. Now, the intent of doing this was that they wanted to have less maintenance, right? All their airplanes, essentially their whole fleet, basically is operating off the same parts. So you didn't have to like worry about, we have a part for this aircraft, but not a part for that aircraft. Like pretty much all of the airports where they're centered, like would have parts for all of the airplanes because they only have 3 different types of craft. It required less training. So your pilots then became essentially interchangeable between the different aircraft because it wasn't like, oh, you're not certified to fly that one, so you can't fly. Like all their pilots were essentially certified across all their aircraft, again, because they had few aircraft. And this also enabled faster turnaround at gates because the ground people, again, were only dealing with the one type of aircraft, and then therefore it was standardized and they could move quickly. Now, on the flip side, right, with every strategic decision, every strategic choice you make, there's a trade-off. And so what do you give up? So in the case of Southwest, right, if you're all in on 737s, if there's some disruption to your supplier 737s, which in this case is Boeing, and we all have heard about Boeing being in the news a lot lately, you put yourself a little bit at risk. Whereas Delta had diversified their fleet across Airbus and Boeing, and thereby, enabling that flexibility. But again, it's a trade-off that each airline has made. So, again, strategic thinking. Let's define a little bit what strategy is. Roger Martin defines it as an integrative set of choices that positions you on a playing field of your choice in a way that you win. So it's a little bit of a lot of words there, right? Think about it. It's a set of choices, it's positioning, and it's knowing what the playing field is, right? So in the case of what we do here, what is the playing field, and how do we know where we're positioned on it? So this is where Wardley mapping comes in. So Wardley mapping was discovered or created by this man named Simon Wardley. And he was the CEO of a company and was asking himself, like, what is good strategy? Like, how do I know my strategy is good? I don't even know what strategy is to some degree. And he encountered Sun Tzu's Art of War. And in Sun Tzu's Art of War, there are 5 elements or factors that are listed to help you in terms of your strategy. That's purpose, landscape, climate, doctrine, and leadership. And what he discovered was that while there's these 5 factors, in fact, they were potentially more of a loop, that there was this strategy loop that you go through, that you would set your purpose, you'd explore the landscape, you'd look at the climate, you'd apply doctrine, and then you would decide, or you act, which would be leadership. And so he overlaid John Boyd's OODA loop on top of this, which is this idea of observe, orient, decide, and act. And so with this as his kind of framework, he realized that there were a bunch of different things, different tools that we could use in these different parts of the strategy loop in order to make better decisions, to make better choices. Again, choices that would position us on the playing field such that we could win. And so we'll talk about some of the different pieces of this today. And we'll start out by focusing on Wardley maps, and that's where that Wardley mapping comes in. And I know, I kind of like maps, and so like this metaphor of a map is really fun. But again, maps help us know where we are, and then help us chart a course to where we want to go. And so strategy, again, being an integrative set of choices, right? I think that integrative is interesting as well, but a set of choices that positions you on a playing field of your choice in a way that you win. Okay, so we're going to use that essentially as our definition of strategy. So what is software architecture? bunch of you are here to talk about software architecture, but I bet if I asked each of you, you would probably each come up with a different definition of what software architecture is. So Martin Fowler has a definition that he has put out there. And he says it's a word we use when we want to talk about design, but want to puff it up to make it sound important. So this actually comes from an interchange between Martin Fowler and Ralph Johnson. And Ralph had a couple other things to say when they had this little discussion. It was a discussion that was in a forum online, so we have a record of it. He said, he defined software architecture as the shared understanding that the expert developers have of the system design. I think it's interesting that he said the expert developers, so it wasn't a naive view of what the system design was, but what the experts understood the system design to be. More tongue-in-cheek, he also said it's the decisions you wish you could get right early in a project, because often we don't get them right, but it's the ones you wish you could get right. And again, architecture is about the important stuff, whatever that is. So are these useful definitions? They're just useful in terms of software architecture? Maybe. They kind of give us a filter. But some of the things that I think about in terms of software architecture is, okay, these decisions that I'm making in terms of architecture, what's the scope of impact? If it's a broad scope of impact, it's probably an architectural decision. If it affects the system's ability to change, like at a large level, that's an architectural decision. Does it affect the long-term cost of the system, right? Which is related to the previous one, but a little bit subtle. And these were all that I heard from different speakers at the Explore DDD conference, which is an excellent conference. I recommend that as well as Connect.Tech here. So if you're interested in software architecture. But really in terms of software architecture, I like Martin Fowler's definition. It's just design, right? Software design is on a continuum from what's the name of this variable to what language are we choosing, right? And all of those decisions in between are kind of on a spectrum. And so this stuff over here, that's kind of the harder to change, is really what we talk about when we're talking about software architecture. So the third component is what is Wardley mapping? We talked about it a little bit. We have the strategy loop, and we have the different things we can do and the different tools we can use at different points of the strategy loop. And I guess there's a reminder that this Wardley mapping helps us understand the landscape, the strategic landscape that we're operating in. Now remember that a map is a symbolic depiction, right? It's not a literal depiction of the space. Right, the famous quote is, a map is not the territory, right? A sufficiently descriptive map would need to, at some point, actually be the territory itself, right? So it's a symbolic depiction, which is one of the reasons I like this particular map. This is a subway map for Manhattan Island in New York City. Anybody know what is maybe off about this map? Like if you're, anybody from New York or familiar with New York? Okay, y'all tell me? Well, it's a subway map. So what's weird about this map? Partly. But the biggest thing, right, is that Central Park, it is the ratio, the dimensions are off, right? Like Central Park is much taller, I guess, if I was to use the dimensions we're looking at here, right? And more elongated, right? Whereas here, we've kind of squished it because it's a subway map. We don't necessarily care about what the distance is between the stops on the subway, but we do care about where we're going to end up. So when we build a map, it is important to remember the purpose for building the map and the audience for the map, right? I've done other presentations where I showed other different maps of this area. And again, there are different levels of detail. There are different aspect ratios and different things in order to, again, communicate what that map is trying to communicate. So what is a Wardley map? This is an example of a Wardley map. Wardley map has a couple components to it. What we're going to start out thinking about is kind of what are these dots or what is these things that are inside the map. The first thing is oftentimes with a Wardley map we'll have a user that's kind of our anchor. We may have something else as our anchor, but often for a lot of the things that we do in software, having a user as an anchor is useful. So in this case, we have the conference attendee. So just as an example, we have a conference attendee as our user. What need might the conference attendee have? One of them might be, my phone does not regularly last the whole day without some sort of charge, especially if I'm at a conference. And so I might need to charge a phone during that conference. And then underneath that are different capabilities that allow us to meet that need. So user needs and capabilities. Now here on the left side, we have the axis that represents the value chain. Like we can argue, again, part of the Central Park being squished thing is kind of to represent, like, it doesn't represent necessarily, the value chain doesn't need to be like super strict in terms of like distances and things like that. But the biggest thing it needs to be thinking about is things that are higher up are dependent on or needs something below it in order to be able to fulfill that need or to make that capability real. So that's what our y-axis is. Our x-axis is evolution. And what this represents is from the left, we have things that are kind of prototype, we call it Genesis, to the far right, which is super evolved, which is a commodity or a utility. So in the case, there's a lot of different ways we can talk about these things, depending upon what we're talking about. So like, if we're talking about a practice might be on the far left novel, meaning like not many people are doing it or nobody's doing it or we're the first people doing it, to the far right where it's generally accepted best practice within an industry. It's currently what like most people are doing, right? And so you have, and things evolve from the right, or from the left to the right. Another lens to look at these stages of evolution are kind of like, okay, maybe the market, right? So at the left-hand side, you may not understand what the market is. It may be undefined to where it's a very mature market. It's like we know exactly how to talk to those people. So again, thinking about that from, again, immature or in Genesis to the right where it's commodity. So one of the concepts here in Wardley mapping is that things evolve. So in this case, right, if I have a Wardley map where I'm charging a phone, if I am a conference organizer and I want to meet the need of somebody who's a conference attendee to be able to charge a phone, I might build a charging station, right? A place where people can go and plug in their phones. And that's why it might end up here in custom built, right? So I have charge a phone here in custom built. But what might it look like if charge a phone were to evolve? What would charge a phone look like if it was in the third stage, which is product? So a couple years ago, I actually attended a conference that had these. Instead of traditional cocktail tables like you have out here that are counter height, they had these, which you can see, maybe, coming out of this middle part. They're actually cables, so that while you're sitting there chatting with somebody, you could plug in your phone and charge your phone. And there's many different iterations of this, different, basically productized solutions to being able to charge a phone in a public space. Now, you could also evolve it to what would it look like evolving charge a phone to a commodity, right? Now, a couple things that happen here when you try to evolve to a commodity or something is evolving to a commodity is that this little black rectangle here represents inertia. there is often a lot of inertia to get something from a product to, to a commodity. And we'll talk more about that later. But if we were to take charge of a phone and say, it's going to be a commodity, what might that look like? Again, I don't really know, but one example might be just USB plugs integrated into sockets. So everywhere you have a power plug, you'd also have a USB plug. So what does that mean? Well, I no longer need the charger, right? I just need a cable. And I'm plugging right into the outlet. Okay, so this is an example of Wardley mapping. So the question you might have is, how is this useful? Like, doing this Wardley mapping exercise, like, okay, great, we can think about how people might meet their needs here. But, and that's really, like, I think one of the primary benefits as a thinking tool, as a sense-making tool, is like, okay, here's something that's going on, let me map it out and maybe understand why things are happening the way they are. Additionally, it's really great as a shared understanding tool, where if you don't quite understand something, you can elicit ideas from somebody else and build a map, and then you have a shared understanding with that other person, and hopefully then be able to plot a way forward. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about, okay, once I have a map, what can I do with that map to help me understand what my moves might be? So, like we said, Wardley mapping falls in that landscape part. The next part of the strategy cycle is climate. And so Simon Wardley, in addition to kind of coming up with this idea of Wardley mapping, he also came up with a climatic pattern list. So these are things that, so the climate, as he defines it, are external forces, right? They're not things that we necessarily control. They're the broader rules of the game, like of the industry or of our government or society. They may be seasonal things, right? If you think about like financial markets, right? Kind of bear market, bull market. You have patterns in terms of like boom bust cycles and things like that. So those sorts of patterns are part of the climate. They're things that you can't fight, but you can figure out how to make appropriate gameplay to react to it. And then also, again, external to you is your competitors' actions. Those are part of the climate. And so he came up with this whole list of things. And we're just going to look at a couple today. So the first one we're going to look at is no single method fits all. Now, in that case, right, in terms of like, again, roughly software architecture, thinking about decisions that we're making that affect the scope, or affect wider scope, affect affect the cost and things like that. You might have to encounter decisions where you're talking about whether you build, whether you buy, whether you partner with somebody, or whether you're open source, or potentially even something else. So again, I mentioned that at 100 Industries, I work on the golf irrigation system. This is a controller. This is installed on a golf course and sits there, and wires are run out to the different sprinkler heads. This is the inside of that. And we are actually in the process of, right now these communicate via radio signals to the superintendent's office, and we have software that runs there. We are in the process as a company of coming up with a cellular module for this so that it can connect to the internet itself. And so in terms of thinking about this product, we have our golf course superintendent. They want to be able to access things via a remote control, essentially like via their phone or something where they don't have to be either physically at the controller box and flipping switches, or even at their office. And so in order to do that, we need an IoT-enabled pilot controller. Pilot's the name of the golf course product. Right, and that needs firmware, that needs software. The firmware needs to be able to communicate. The communication needs to be able to access compute power, also needs to access cell service, and all of these need to access the network generally. So, one of the first things that I noticed when I first discovered Wardley mapping was its overlap with the purpose alignment model. The purpose alignment model says on one axis we have mission critical, and on the other axis we have market differentiation. So just quickly, right, differentiating is where you need to be better than your competitors, right? That's where you're going to get your advantage. Parity is where you don't have any benefit from doing better than your competitors, but you need to do as well as they can. And then partnering is where it's differentiating, like it's important, but it's not mission critical. So like if you could think about this in terms of like brand partnerships or something where it's like, well, I don't know. We're not going to talk that much about this model, but this idea of like, okay, what's mission critical, what's market differentiating, can be useful. And so thinking about Pilot, we have kind of these two groups of things, right? In the blue box, like those are things that are differentiating. And so that's why they're in custom built. We are going to build those ourselves. We're not going to outsource it. We're not going to buy a third party. We obviously work with manufacturers on some of these things, but we do actually a lot of manufacturing in-house. We build the software in-house. We have a firmware team. All of those things are custom built. Now, the things on the right in the kind of orangish box, we are not going to build our own cell service in order to service our customers around this, right? We're not going to build our own computers, right? We're going to use AWS CC2 instances or serverless in order to meet those compute needs. And so part of, again, looking at the Wardley map helps us to understand if we have something that's on the left, right, in that blue box, if we had something over there that didn't make sense to build, then maybe we are looking at it in the wrong way, and maybe we need to adjust how we're thinking about it. Another example would be this. So I used to work at a company that did English language assessment. So you would speak, and it would assess your ability to speak English. Now, if you look at this, what thing seems out of place, if anything? I know it's a lot, and it's right after lunch, but well, your support ticketing system, I wouldn't build that custom, right? Well, I mean, it's just like what here seems out of place. The test taker. Well, so that's the user, right? That where that sits and the evolution is questionable where it should actually sit. The thing I'm looking at is JavaScript framework. Come on, where are we at, guys? Okay, right? Like JavaScript framework should not be in custom built. Unless you're Google or Facebook or X or whatever, like if you're a large tech company with very specific needs, especially now, you should not be building your own JavaScript framework. Some people fall into it because they're like, oh, I don't need a framework, which we could debate whether you need a framework or not, but right, really this should be over here. You should be using one of the many off-the-shelf frameworks, as problematic as they sometimes can be. Like using that gives you a lot of support from the community. It gives you a lot of help from other people, as well as everybody knows it. Right? You're not having to onboard people and say, hey, you got to now learn our custom framework. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is efficiency enables innovation, and increased stability of lower order systems increases agility and speed of recombination, which is basically a fancy way to say as things evolve, it enables new things to come up, right? If you think about it in terms of as power becomes more ubiquitous, then that enables us to have all of the appliances and stuff that we have today, right? Those lower order systems increase the ability to have recombination at higher levels. So going back to immersion, again, the primary way that we would assess language there was through what we call the listen and repeat language assessment. So somebody would speak, so you'd get a prompt, and then you would speak the prompt. Or actually, no, sorry, you would hear the prompt, and then you would speak it back. And so the idea was that this was not a direct measure of your language ability, but was a kind of very highly correlated indirect measure, meaning that those that had high language ability were able to retain enough of what they heard and be able to say it back in a way that made sense, right? Because if you actually understand what's going on, then you're going to be able to retain it better than if it's just a bunch of syllables. So again, this is the map of the assessment, or at least the test taker. We had a couple things in here that we were considering. So this is more just like an aha that I had at one point, which relates to this idea of the lower order enabling agility. I realized that an ASR is automated speech recognition, right? And at the time we were using Google's, IBM's, and somebody else's. I can't remember. And so we were using all these off-the-shelf automated speech recognition systems, right? And I realized that even 10 years earlier, before all of those started to become a thing, become products that we could very easily use, like we, as a company, would not have been able to exist, right? The thing we were building was built on top of the fact that the ASR, the automated speech recognition, had become like almost a commodity, like very well productized, very easy to use, largely because of the proliferation of smart devices that the big tech companies started to use with the smart assistants and stuff like that. And then they opened up their APIs. So again, as that ASR, again, thinking about it, as that ASR got closer to commodity, and that enabled us to build scoring code and a listen and repeat that basically allowed us to exist. You have a question? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question was, like, if they're not discrete steps, like, what does it mean to be more or less custom built or more or less productized? I mean, again, going back to the analogy of the subway map, like, it's all a little bit of feeling, right? It's like, in terms of custom built, like, you may have things that are custom built that, like this is like the second one you're building, right? Like, that might be farther to the left, whereas, like, hey, we're custom building them, but we're custom building them like one a week or something. Whereas that might be getting closer to be productized. Like it's not enough that we're built a generalized product, but we're custom building like, think a lot about what people do with like websites, right? A lot of those are custom built on top of frameworks, right? Sure. Yeah. Right. So there might be. Yeah, you might disagree, right? And there's a couple different things, right? There's where are we considering this to be evolutionarily? There's what's the market considered to be evolutionarily? Is there and sometimes if there's a difference between those two, like again, thinking about the JavaScript framework, like as an industry, we might say it's in commodity, but we may say that we're going to custom build our own. Now, that difference might be an advantage, right? It might be a strategic advantage that we're going to push on, but it might also be something stupid that we're doing just because we're stubborn, right? And so knowing the difference between those two and at least having that discussion and understanding that there is that gap and that difference in understanding between the different ways that we're viewing different components in terms of their evolution is a lot of the value you can get from sharing maps with other people. Thank you. Okay. Oh, so I guess my point here is like, again, the things that are in custom built are going to be your secret sauce, right? And the things that are pushing to the right, like those are the things that are increasingly commoditized, which are going to be available to everybody. And so, again, depending on what you're trying to do, and we'll look at this in another example, like maybe stay away from things that are in that area. Focus on the things that are on the left that are going to give you the most value. Like, don't invest a lot in your own JavaScript framework if you don't need to. Okay. Everything evolves. So again, looking again at that whole idea of an ASR, within the company, and this is kind of vital speculation or kind of idle like talk, but there was this idea that I had like a visceral reaction to, like, hey, we're working with this like boutique ASR that like gives us a whole lot more data than kind of the ones that were off the shelf from the big cloud providers. And when somebody was like, well, you know, if we get big enough, then maybe we could buy them. And I thought, that seems weird. I don't know if that makes sense. And so one of the things that I realized, again, once I got into Wardley mapping, was, so Carnegie was actually that company. And so I put that separate on the map because it was kind of this boutique thing. And I realized that as the ASR approached that commodity line, one of the things that Simon talks about is that entering that category, as things move into commodity, he refers to it as war. Which, again, there's a lot of kind of militaristic, war strategy language in a lot of this. But basically, it's this period where, you largely have this, to the left, you largely have peaceful coexistence between different products. But like when you're trying to become the standard or trying to figure out what the standard is, there's a lot of upheaval. And so the two things that he characterized this with are, one, rapid explosion of higher order systems, which we talked about in the last example. But the second one is you also have new entrants building commodity services. So one thing you might want to think about is like, hey, there are a bunch of ASRs. At some point, it's going to become commodity. Like maybe you want to jump in and be the best, right? And so again, thinking about like, if I'm a new company, I might want to jump into that. But as a company that is doing something else, it could be a distraction. So again, like just being aware that, again, as this ASR goes into that place, like unless you want to like focus on that and go to war, like things that are close to being commodity, like maybe avoid those in your company. That's also potentially like, again, at a higher level, maybe divest yourself of those or find a commodity solution that more meets your needs. The next climactic pattern is components, that we'll look at is components can co-evolve. So one of the kind of canonical examples of this is as compute evolved, right? If you think about like, like mainframes, standardized servers like your, rack servers to cloud computing. The practices that go along with how you maintain, how you deal with systems have to co-evolve with it, right? So you can see that, right, you had where, at a certain point where you had large machines, this, like mainframes, like when they're down, and you can't like get a new one, right, very quickly. You're gonna have to replace parts or whatever. And so you have disaster recovery practices that go with that. So you might have a backup, right? You might have two so you can continue to, serve your customers. But there are certain practices that are good practices there. Whereas as we move to the cloud, you have a different set of practices that pop up, right? When it's easy and cheap to create a new server, you don't have to over-provision necessarily. You might want to over-provision a little bit, but you're not going to double your provisioning or anything like that. You're gonna auto-scale, right? And that's the new practice that was not available to you in the era of large mainframes. An example from, again, another example from immersion was one of the things that I recognized. We were mapping the immersion buyer. So the person who was actually buying the assessment, which wasn't always the person taking the assessment, like what did they need and why were we sometimes having a hard time connecting with those users or those buyers? And so one of the things we realized that at the end of it, really what we were selling, we weren't selling an assessment. Most people were using our assessments for hiring. And so they were looking at, okay, I need to hire this person who possibly speaks, we want them to speak a language that they don't necessarily speak natively. How do we assess that they can speak that language? And again, not really that they could speak the language, but like, should we hire them to speak the language? And so we realized that this was this idea of we're recommending a hire. And so one of the recognitions I had from talking to some of the salespeople is that we were also asking them to evolve their hiring process. By going from what they were currently doing, most of them, what they would do is have a person on their staff who would call up the candidate and talk with them on the phone for like 5 minutes, and then give them a score and decide whether or not they should move on to the next step or not. We were asking them to disrupt that by using an automated tool. We were also asking them to maybe move that assessment further forward in their process so that they could filter out people, more quickly, potentially. And they were very resistant to it. We never actually did it, but I kind of started to recommend, hey, maybe we need to do some training and some help on, hey, here's how your hiring process could change as part of adopting our system. Okay, so that was the last thing on the climate list that I wanted to talk about today. But there's also a list of doctrine. Now, doctrine is a little bit different from climate. Again, climate is outside factors, things that are affecting us. As we've entered the doctrine phase of the cycle, doctrine refers to standard ways of operating. And I kind of refer to it as it's almost context-free advice, which I usually avoid. But there are certain things that are pretty universally good ideas. Not that you should always follow it, but maybe almost always. And so, again, Wardley has a list of different doctrines. And so we're going to look at a couple of these. So actually, I think we might be only going to hit one. But the one we're going to look at is think aptitude and attitude. Oh, that's right. And there's one more. And there is no one culture. So attitude and aptitude, and there is no one culture. So how this plays into Wardley mapping and maybe how you are organizing your software teams is that he comes up with these kind of 3 prototypes, archetypes of different types of people, or at least different mindsets, right? You have the pioneer mindset, the settler mindset, and the town planner mindset. And his thought is that when you're in Genesis and early custom built, you want a pioneer mindset. Then you move to settlers, meaning you're settling down, you're trying to standardize things, and then town planners, you're just trying to operationalize the crap out of things, just make it smooth as possible. And again, when you're in a commodity space, you're not trying to innovate a lot in terms of what you're doing on a daily basis. You may be innovating on processes to make it, but you're just trying to make what you are outputting cheaper and faster. And so the thought here, right, is that if each of these colors represents a team, we might have a team that has a couple components they're responsible for that are kind of in this Genesis custom built, and they might have some that are over here in product. That might cause some problems, right? Because it often requires a different mindset to be operating on components that are in these different spaces. The one that would really be hard is if this team that's orange has a thing in Pioneer and also a thing that is basically in commodity in town planner mode. So this can make it hard for a team to be able to operate effectively and really to be happy with what they're doing. This is, again, just a graphic that has some of the ideas here for these different archetypes. You think about pioneers like to deal with novel things, they're always looking after the new thing, whereas the town planners are doing essential cost of business work, right? High volume, very standardized. But if you look at that section in the middle where it's happy with, pioneers are happy with failure. It's hey, we're just experimenting, we're just trying new things. It's uncertain, and that's okay. Whereas in a town planner, you're like operational efficiency, are all the metrics running right? Are we, do we have, 6 nines of uptime or whatever? Whereas the pioneers are if it's down half the time, it's okay. I mean, maybe not, but that type of thing. And so one of the things you might want to think about when you're thinking about aligning your people with your software architecture is maybe instead of just giving things to people maybe based on technology or what things are adjacent within the system, you might want to think about it in terms of this pioneer, settler, and town planner, that things that are going to need more operational efficiency, maybe give those to one team so that they don't have to keep switching their mindset and possibly be either, just bouncing around in terms of their mental state in terms of doing different things. So the more you can do that, I think in general, the happier people are going to be. So So I mentioned this earlier, right? It's this idea the map is not the territory, right? So these maps that we're showing, I'm showing that they're not complete representations of anything. If I come here, right? This is not complete. We actually got to this point, we kept digging. We got to this point where we kind of oh, we got an insight, let's move on, right? Because we're not going to find stuff that, we're not going to be able to completely map out everything. And so that's okay, right? You're trying to just map to the point where you are getting some value out of it. So how do you start? The easiest way to start was just with the pen or paper and pencil, right? Just start. Just try to draw, sketch out something. I see a lot of people with notebooks. Just think of something, think of a user you're working with or a system you're working with, and just think, okay, what were the needs? And what things are we bringing to the table that would help to meet those needs? And then draw lines, think about where they're involved. You're probably going to scratch things out, move it around. That's okay. If you are uncomfortable with drawing things in real life, there are a lot of tools out there if you want to do it digitally. Most of the whiteboarding tools that are out there actually will have Wardley mapping templates if you go into whatever template section. I have not used all of these, but I've used Miro, and their template is pretty good. It actually steps you through some of the steps in order to get a decent Wardley map. Since, again, most of you are here for software architecture, I assume most of you have software roots. And so in that case, you can do maps as code. So most of the maps that I showed you here today, I used this system called onlinewardleymaps.com. And they actually have a plugin for VS Code where you can use their DSL here that basically defines components. You define different things, you define connections between things, and you can basically generate a Wardley map. A lot of the times what I've done is I've sat down with somebody and they have something that they're trying to deal with, and I will sit there at the tool and map it out. and then we'll have a discussion. We'd like just be sharing my screen. So it's pretty cool. And then also the advantage is that you can then put it in source control, and you can, because it's just text. Another system that's out there, I haven't played with a whole lot. It's newer, but it allows for, it's basically like Google Docs for Wardley mapping, in as much as you can collaboratively edit. And it's called mapkeep.com. And so if you want to do this with somebody who's remote to you, and you want to actually have both people be able to interact with it, this is a really good system. And one of the cool things is that it actually, because online Wardley mapping format became kind of the de facto format, like you want to import things into here from the online Wardley map and actually export things in the online Wardley map format. So, hopefully I've given you like a little bit of flavor of what you can do with Wardley maps. I would recommend going and watching Simon Wardley talk about this. He's got multiple different versions of his talk, Crossing the River by Feeling the Stones, that are out there on YouTube. This is like actually how I found him at first. He's got a book that's out there as like Creative Commons licensed. And so after like feeling like, oh, this is something I want to learn more about, I went and tried to read the book. And I tried to read the book alone. But as anybody that's played The Legend of Zelda knows, it is dangerous to go alone. So what I ended up is like, we get to like the 3rd chapter, and I'm like, I don't know what's going on anymore. And then I'd forget about it for a while and try it again. It's funny enough that Simon actually posted this a couple years ago, saying, how long does it take to learn Wardley mapping? For most people, about 7 years. Seriously? Yep. It takes about 6 years and 11 months spent going, I really need to learn this mapping stuff. Then the last month actually doing it. So I encourage you to just try it out. What I ended up doing to read the book was I actually created a book club and said, hey, anybody want to read this with me? And about 15 people joined the first week. By the end, there was only 4 of us, but we did get through the book, and we had really great discussions pretty much every week around a chapter of the book, which kept us on pace, as well as helped us to like actually consume the content and understand it. There's also, I'll show a little bit later, there's also a bunch of other good resources out there as well. But I think the main thing is like start mapping. Like if you're feeling inspired, like you're feeling like, okay, this might be interesting. If you're feeling like maybe I don't quite know what to do with it, like just try it. It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to even represent reality. You'll likely get some insight out of realizing, hey, this thing that I think has evolved here maybe isn't as you show it to other people. Another place you can go to learn more about Wardley mapping, PipDecks has the Strategy Tactics deck. It's a little bit expensive, but it's on sale right now as part of their end-of-year, holiday, Black Friday, whatever you might call it, sale. But a lot of the cards in this have different ideas from Wardley mapping that can be helpful. Now, I have a bunch of, again, a couple other resources that you might want to look at. LearnWardleyMapping.com is actually really good. There's some courses on there. There's a bunch of free content as well. And if you'd like to connect with me, I'd be happy to connect with you. Ideally, put a note as you connect on LinkedIn, so just saying, hey, I saw you at Connect.Tech, just so sometimes I just get random connection messages, and I'm like, I don't know who you are. But yeah, I'd be happy to sit down and like get on a call with anybody that wants to learn how to do this a little bit better or try it with something that they're doing now. Normally, I would offer to sit down with you after the session, but I do have to run. But yeah, hopefully this was useful. Hopefully you can think about like where you might apply this, how you might think about what software decisions you're making with your software that could be enhanced by using Wardley mapping. So thank you.